Sa report, tingnan pa nakasalanan ng video.
Media educators and learners called to become press freedom.
Sa report, tingnan pa nakasalanan ng video.
Media educators and learners called to become press freedom.
With the Zamboanga crisis now on its third week, many, including the government, do not know when exactly this will end. So far, the conflict between the Moro National Liberation Front and the Armed Forces of the Philippines has resulted in the deaths and displacements of hundreds. Many have called for peace talks and ceasefires between the MNLF and armed forces. However, these were not successful, even with the intervention of high government officials, due to the rebel group's belief that the peace agreement they forged with the government was not fully utilized or fulfilled, thus opening the discussion on the GRP-MNLF peace agreement, which was approved and signed 20 years ago.
Talagang dadaanan natin itong prosesong ito na may mga ibang talagang ayaw makisama tungo sa kapayapaan. At matagal ko na sinabi, napagtalagay ko na rin ninyo, sa gustong makipag-usap na kapayapaan talagang full force tayo, full steam. Sa ayaw naman at talagang maghahasik na laging obligasyon natin pangalagaan ang kapakanan ng ating mga kababayan.
Will creating another agreement with the rebel group stop the altercation happening in Zamboanga right now? How will this affect the peace agreement talks going on now with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and consequently the entire Muslim Mindanao? Good evening, you are watching News Cafe on the Solar News Channel. Sitting in for Jing Magsaysay, I'm Karen Jimeno. Tonight we are joined by the chairperson of the Government Peace Panel, Professor Miriam Coronel-Ferrer. Good evening and thank you for joining us,
Yes,
Professor Miriam.
Good evening, Karen. It's my pleasure.
First, we'll start with the basics. A lot of people are still confused about the difference between the MNLF and MILF. What's
That's
the
right.
fundamental difference between these two groups?
Well, the people who founded the MILF broke away from Missouri way back in the 1970s.
So MNLF was out first.
The first. Everybody was MNLF in the beginning until some group felt that the kind of leadership exercised by Missouri was too personalistic, too centered on himself, and so several of them put up the MILF eventually. By the 1980s, in fact, the MILF was the much bigger organization compared to the MNLF.
Okay. And currently, the government is in talks with the MILF.
Yes, I chair the government panel that talks with the MILF, and that's one product of that was the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro. There are still 4 documents that should go into this FAB. We're done with 2 and we're still working on the remaining 2 annexes, and these are the annexes on power sharing and normalization. On the other hand, with regards to the MNLF, there's a review process. It's facilitated by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the review process seeks to look into the implementation of the 1996 final peace agreement with the MNLF.
Okay, so there's actually 2 agreements, but with the MNLF, it's the review of the
Implementation,
tripartite agreement
yes.
that was way back in 1996. But the ongoing negotiations for an agreement of the Bangsamoro is with the MILF.
That's right. So the intention with this process with the MILF is to institute the same notion of an autonomous government, but with new features that will incorporate other aspirations that may not have been accommodated in the final peace agreement, or other changes that will probably need to make good governance, accountability, and of course self-governance more feasible.
With respect to the MILF, what's the status of the current agreement with them, and including the wealth sharing?
Well, we signed the wealth sharing annex last August, and now we're hammering out the details that will go into the power sharing annex. It's a long list of powers that are being agreed on, powers that the Bangsamoro government will exercise, powers that will be shared or concurrent or joint between the central and the Bangsamoro government, and of course reiterating that certain matters will remain the reserve powers of the central government, like foreign policy and national defense.
Okay, so is this nearing completion, the talks with MILF?
That's the goal, to complete this so that we can move full steam ahead with the implementation.
Was this affected by the current crisis in Zamboanga?
Well, of course, everybody was affected. We know that we are now facing a serious humanitarian problem in Zamboanga because of the attacks that were launched by forces loyal to Nur Miswari, and to that extent, we are all affected, and we commiserate with the people of Zamboanga City who had to bear the brunt of this act of aggression committed by one force. Unfortunately, the supposed leader of this caper is denying all accountability for that incident. But insofar as the negotiations are concerned, we are all the more determined to continue with the process. We know that we cannot afford conflict in other parts of Mindanao, and as soon as we're able to secure this peace agreement with the MILF, then all the processes can be put in place, and we hope that everybody who refuses to use violence as the way of life or the mode of politics in this country will be able to come in and join, because there will be space for everybody in this process.
Okay, but do you think that Nur Miswari or the MNLF attacked Zamboanga because of the ongoing negotiations with the MILF?
Maybe to that extent, they felt that they were losing the ground, and that is actually what has been happening all this time. Nur Miswari was given the chance to govern the arm. He signed the peace agreement in 1996. By 1997, he headed two bodies: the Southern Philippine Council for Peace and Development and the arm itself. Unfortunately, he proved to be a bad leader. He transitioned from a revolutionary leader to statesman in a very, very bad way. And he was given the chance, but now he wants another chance. But it's not possible for a government just to simply give everything again to him in a silver platter.
That was actually my next question, because I was curious. You mentioned the posts that he held basically under the previous administration and under the current administration, but it seems like he transitioned from being governor to now, again, a revolutionary. What happened in between? How did he end up basically becoming a revolutionary again?
Well, there have always been this kind of a review process with him. In 2010, when the President Aquino came in, the tripartite was convened, and at that time, you remember that the ARM election was postponed, and an OIC governor was appointed eventually by President Aquino after the law was passed in Congress. At that time, Miswari had wanted to assume that post, and it was not possible. The main intention for the postponement of the election was, of course, to synchronize the elections, but at the same time to institute the needed reforms in the arm following, we went through the Ampatuan, the Maguindanao massacre, and all of that cheating and corruption that has been going on in the arm. And Miswari could not simply be the face of that kind of reform that the president had wanted instituted. And that has made Miswari unhappy ever since. It seems that, it's nothing less than giving back to him the governorship of the arm could satisfy what he wants in this process.
Okay, but currently, there's still this review of the tripartite agreement that was basically concluded in 1996. And how is this tripartite agreement different from the Bangsamoro agreement?
The final peace agreement, obviously, one obvious difference is that there was no component pertaining with the arms and weapons of the MNLF, and that's why you can see that this remains a problem up to now. But in this process with the MILF, the fourth annex that we're working on, which is on normalization, will address all of these security issues. The matter of loose firearms, the matter of decommissioning of weapons and combatants of the MILF, addressing all the other security concerns, private armed groups and criminal groups. But in any case, in the tripartite review process, one of the agenda is to identify elements that will be needed to amend the current law. And since we are going through the process of basically repealing the current law, RA 9054, with regards to, which is the legal framework for the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, then all of these components can certainly go into the process of amending or repealing the current law.
Okay, so in other words, both are actually complementary. They're not conflicting agreements.
Not at all, because basically some of the issues that the MNLF felt was not addressed in the law that was the amendatory law in 2001 could very well go into this new law. And in fact, based on the last agreement that we signed, the last annex that we signed on wealth sharing, we can guarantee everyone that this now provides for a much better fiscal arrangement for the future Bangsamoro. The sharing arrangements as far as government revenues from energy and mineral resources are concerned have been increased, as well as shares from national taxes that are collected from the region. And most important, a new mechanism that will define the budgetary allocation for the arm has been set out in the wealth sharing annex. So some of the weaknesses in the institutional design or the structure of the current arm is being addressed now in the annexes that we are working on.
Okay, so is it accurate to say that the Bangsamoro agreement actually includes everyone, including the MNLF, and no one is left out?
It will provide for a more representative system. In the framework agreement, we said that we will have a ministerial form of government, which means political parties will be very important. If people want political power, they will have to run in elections. They will need a political party to get a seat in the Legislative Assembly of the Bangsamoro. And among themselves, they will decide who will be the chief minister, and the cabinet officials, of course, will flow from that in that kind of political setup. So the call now is for everybody to participate. If you want political power, put up your political party and run in elections. It cannot happen that somebody who wants political power go into the streets bringing along armed men and declaring that they would want to take over. That definitely what happened in Zamboanga City simply just goes against the grain of this peaceful process that we are trying to put in place to institutionalize a much better political arrangement in Muslim Mindanao.
Okay, well, given the situation in Zamboanga or even what Nur Miswari did OPAP have to change anything in terms of their approach with the peace talks with MILF?
With the MILF, we're moving ahead, but we are still trying to get some members of the MNLF to participate in this process, and some of them have actually taken part. If you remember, the OIC government in the ARM actually included several key MNLF personalities, which means that they had participated in that reform process of the ARM, and that will segue into the Bangsamoro government. But at the same time, with regards to the MNLF, government has not abandoned the tripartite review process, even though some sectors are already saying that by this act of the Miswari faction, that they have actually abandoned the track. But in any case, government is saying that we're ready to meet with all the different leaders, the different factions of the MNLF in this process, in the review process that is facilitated by the OIC.
And it sounds like if Nur Miswari wanted to participate in this new framework under the Bangsamoro agreement, he can by forming his party and just complying with the process.
You know, the MNLF never converted into something else other than just being MNLF commands, base commands, and MNLF. And we can see that the MILF is thinking differently on this. They are preparing for the creation of a political party that will embody their reform agenda. They are working with civil society organizations to strengthen also the participation of Moro civil society in both the political and the social processes, socio-economic processes that are very important. But the MNLF never did this. They remained, at least on the part of Miswari, after his stint as governor. You know, he escaped to Malaysia at the time, and he was in jail, right? Until he was returned to the Philippines, and for the interest of closing the review process with regards to the peace agreement with the MNLF, he was actually, the charges against him were actually dropped.
Yes.
And so there is this process that he was supposed to be observing, but unfortunately he decided to take matters again differently.
Okay, thank you for enlightening us. I have more questions for you. Let's take a short break. News Cafe will return after these messages. You are still watching News Cafe on the Solar News Channel, and we are still joined by our guest, Government Peace Panel Chairperson Miriam Coronel-Ferrer. Good evening, Professor Miriam. And my other question was, basically, with respect to Nur Miswari, do you think he still has power over Muslim Mindanao?
Well, you cannot really, it's not, Miswari already made his mark in the history of the Bangsamoro, or those people who have self-identified as Bangsamoro. In the 1970s, he was able to generate that kind of support from among our fellow Filipinos who felt that they were minorities in our country, in a largely Christian society. And it was him who actually popularized the concept of a Bangsamoro. But the firebrand, charismatic leader of the 1970s never really grew up. I mean, Che Guevara died at a very young age, and to that extent, he never had a chance to diminish the charisma that surrounds his name. But you can look at other leaders who were able to mobilize vast constituencies and ended up not in a very good state afterwards, because they did not transition from being firebrands, revolutionary leaders, into people who can actually lead and govern their societies.
Into statesmen. You
Yes.
think that's
How did Gaddafi end up? He was killed by his own people.
Yes.
He, after being in power for such a long time, he ended up just not governing the right way. Miswari was given that chance, but at this time, at his latter stage in his life, he wanted nothing else but to retrieve that kind of glory, retrieve that kind of preeminent position.
back in the 70s.
Back in the 70s among his own people. Now, there are still people who really respect him for that kind of leadership that he played in the early stages of the Bangsamoro quest for self-determination. But unfortunately, in these recent events, he was able to mobilize support largely through misinformation.
And there are some speculations that the government is to be blamed because Nur Miswari or the MNLF were left out in the Bangsamoro agreement. But you clarified earlier that, of course, if you follow the process under the Bangsamoro agreement, they can participate. But can you clarify basically really what happened, whether government had a role to play in making MNLF feel left out and therefore having to resort in violence in Zamboanga?
Well, as I said, government has actually been engaging Miswari all the time. We have met with him. I also sat in the review process. We have met with him in several parts of Indonesia over the last few years. But what is hard to understand with some of the statements being made is that government is to be blamed for what happened in Zamboanga. I mean, how can we condone such an act? Are we saying that if we had given Miswari what he wanted, which was nothing less than the leadership of the arm, then Zamboanga would not have happened? But what would have happened to the arm if government had conceded to that kind of demand? What would have happened to the people who have actually been given the chance to vote him into power? He ran in the elections in 2013 and he landed last among those who contended for the governorship of the arm. So clearly, it's not possible to satisfy Miswari with regards to what he demands for himself. We would have wanted both the MNLF and the MILF to sit together on the table, but you cannot force that. If the table is too small for one person, two persons cannot fit in that table. In fact, that is also our problem with with the review process with the MNLF. As you know, that they have factionalized into different groups. And we have tried to bring in the other personalities who have their own respective followings but have dissociated themselves with Miswari. And Miswari has always resented that because he has always insisted that he is the sole representative of the Bangsamoro people.
Okay, what about other speculations that the Bangsamoro agreement and the conflict in Zamboanga are merely diversions for the current pork barrel scam?
Well, the question there is who is diverting whom? I mean, who has too much to lose in this current investigation? So are we saying that those who have been charged with crimes of plunder and all that are the ones doing this? Or is it actually the government that is trying to get this investigation through, the DOJ that is working very hard to put together all the cases that will need to be filed following due process? Is it the government who wants this added aggravation of having to address urban guerrilla warfare in the city of Zamboanga and then be responsible again for rebuilding the city that has been devastated, destroyed by acts of hostile acts committed by some 200, 300, 400 men.
Yeah, sounds very convoluted. Convoluted. But is there, do you think, a possibility that after the Bangsamoro framework is finalized, that finally this will really put peace in Mindanao?
You know, it's not only us, government, or the MILF that can make peace possible in Mindanao. And it's not going to be easy. We know that. I think at one point I said things will still get worse. In August, I said things will still get worse because before things get better. And we've seen that. We had the bombings in Cotabato, in Cagayan de Oro. We have the continued hostilities between the government and the BIFF, which broke away from the MILF. These are going on, and now the Zamboanga crisis. But if we abandon this process, neither will it bring about peace. What we have now is a leadership in the MILF that is willing to take the nonviolent path, and we have to support this process. MILF is the biggest group. After the MILF, there are the different base commands under different personalities of the MNLF. And then after that, there is the BIFF, which has a very extreme ideology, which are using bombs and other indiscriminate forms of warfare, and probably link to other more internationalized groups that have no qualms about using all kinds of explosives and targeting innocent civilians for these kinds of operations. So that is the kind of complexity that we are addressing in this process. It will not bring about automatic peace, but it can bring about a process where everybody will be given a fair chance to participate and to institute the kinds of reforms that are needed to make the government more responsive to its own constituents.
Why do you think MNLF chose to attack Zamboanga, of all places? It's not even part of the ARMM.
They were constricted in Sulu. Miswari was holed up in one area, and if you want to make a statement, Zamboanga is the most accessible urban area. You take your motorboats, several motorboats. There are so many porous borders along the coast of Zamboanga, the whole of Zamboanga Peninsula, in fact, because we do have reports that some of them actually came from the northern, up north in Zamboanga Sibugay, Zamboanga del Norte, and so on. So to that extent, Zamboanga really feels vulnerable right now.
Because of its strategic location.
That's right. So we can really understand the kind of fear and insecurity that has emerged, and we're hoping that it's not going to be translated into Christian-Muslim conflict in Zamboanga and as well as elsewhere.
Okay. If the Bangsamoro Agreement is implemented, do you think the other factions that you mentioned, the ones that are willing to resort to violence, will be prevented from basically pursuing this path?
Maybe some of the foot soldiers, maybe some of the rank and file, those who are easily, who see that this is not going to be their life, and would rather have a crack at having a more normal life. But for some of the leadership, especially the ideologues, I think they have taken the path to violence, and they are not in any mood to abandon that path. And these are the groups that we will have to isolate and deal with separately. But for all those who are willing to take this path of gradual reform, the parliamentary path as well, and willing to give peace a chance so that development and progress can come into the communities. That's the one that we're really trying to consolidate and work with.
Okay. Professor Miriam, do you think we can expect peace? At least, I know you said it's going to get worse before it gets better, but at least medium to long term, do you think we can expect peace in Mindanao?
Well, that's the goal. Certainly, we don't want a peace agreement that will bring about most conflict. And if we're having a hard time hammering the details for the annexes, the remaining annexes, it's because we're trying to ensure that we will not repeat the same mistakes that happened in the past.
Okay, that's very inspiring and comforting. Thank you, Professor Miriam, for joining us tonight. And that was really very helpful for us to understand Zamboanga. And thank you for also clearing out all the other crazy speculations on why this is all happening. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. I would like to thank our guest, Professor Miriam Coronel-Ferrer of the Government Peace Panel, for being with us tonight. Join us again next Thursday for another round of discussions here on News Cafe. Sitting in for Jing Magsaysay, I'm Karen Jimeno. Good night.
Sa karanasan ko po, hindi naman nakasalanan ng video.
Media educators